My friends, this Sunday everything changed in Latin America, starting with the fall of the left in Colombia. Yes, the shield of the Americas, the advance of the United States on the continent, and yet another defeat that Iran also suffers here in Latin America. Mix all of this together in a cauldron and we have a powder keg about to explode. And to talk about the behind the scenes of what's happening here, once again with him, Galante from the United States, a councilman in Texas and one of the top authorities in international geopolitical analysis. Galante, welcome, my friend. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Shimon Oliveira, thank you for the invitation. Not only has Colombia turned the page on the left, but also the resignation of the Prime Minister, who is a globalist and leftist in England today as we speak here. We have the whole thing with Iran and the United States, whether or not the Strait of Hormuz will be closed, the threat of resuming bombings, and most importantly, the arrests continue. And the capture of members of Tren de Aragua, Comando Vermelho, and the PCC. In the United States, today, the arms supplier for Comando Vermelho in the Guianas, was arrested. And the shield of the Americas remains strong, stronger than ever.
Good afternoon, Shimon Oliveira. Thank you for allowing me to address your audience. It's also a pleasure to be here with my friend Galante in these discussions on topics where he certainly has interesting data and information about geopolitics, especially related to Brazil and the United States. Yes, I consider this shift that happened in Colombia yesterday to be very relevant, and it has direct implications for Brazil. I think the Brazilian political system, Brazilians should analyze what's happening in South America when we look at our entire strategic environment, neighboring countries, and what's going on with our neighbors. I also highlight this current situation in the United Kingdom with the resignation of the Prime Minister from the Labour Party. I believe this also prompts reflection in the European political system and what's happening in Europe. These are two topics that I see as relevant right now.
You have to analyze it very well, guys. So it takes work to do. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and leave a like on the video. We have Galante, we have Commander Batistella to bring us this analysis of what happened last week at the G7 and especially here in Brazil. Galante, you have valuable behind-the-scenes information about everything that's happening, and I want to start with Colombia. Why? The Planalto Palace is in a panic. They never expected that they could lose an election in Colombia, which is a stronghold of the left, right? We know all the difficulties the right had to face to get to this moment. There in Colombia, since you mainly have the support of narco-terrorism, right? Backing Petro, backing the left, because Colombia was the last stronghold. And the worst news of all for us Brazilians, we have two pieces of news, one good and one bad. The good one is that Petro lost, right? The left lost there in Colombia. But the bad news is that everything that's no good over there will end up in Brazil. And inevitably, a mass exodus to Brazil of those narco-terrorists from the São Paulo Forum is already starting. Because the candidate who won there, Estrella, he's like Bukele, he's like Milei, and he's an ally of the United States. Galante, what's going to happen, Galante?
Look, what will really happen in Colombia, only time and the facts will tell. But you can predict what won't happen in Brazil in these elections. The narco-state's desperation led them to assassinate Miguel Uribe, the right-wing candidate who was ahead. That assassination was certainly the tipping point where people opened their eyes and saw that they were once again being led to bring back a regime that not only assassinates opponents, but also brings economic disaster. So the Brazilian operatives who thought that taking the candidate out of the game, like they tried with President Bolsonaro in 2018, assassinating his son, which is a fact, he receives death threats and his security has been reinforced and should continue to be reinforced. This tactic backfires. Colombia is showing that. The second thing that affects Brazil is the issue of the fairness of the elections, okay? And there's Petro saying that there was interference from Iranian intelligence. Yeah, the fact is, in any election around the world, everyone is watching. Not just Russian, Iranian, Israeli, Brazilian, American intelligence, everyone is watching. The fact is that these elections were violated, and that will have to be proven. The voting machines in Colombia are third generation. They print paper, a receipt for the vote. There is public scrutiny. The voter sees who they are voting for, and when choosing the vote, it's possible to do a recount, which is not what happens in Brazil, right? So this whole story about the vote not being valid, the election not being valid, is another shot that's going to backfire. Why? Because if the left keeps demanding the level of scrutiny of the voting machines recounting the votes, they can't demand the same thing in Brazil. And it will increasingly expose the Brazilian system that Lula, who we'll discuss later, visited. And the verb is, what is it called? There was a show of verbiage after the G7 event accusing President Trump and threatening President Trump not to interfere in the Brazilian elections, and also trying to suggest the Brazilian electoral system to members of the G7 and the UN, saying that it's the safest in the world. Well, if the left in Colombia is relying on the counterproof to do a recount, how can his friends, President Lula, brag about a system that's the only one in the world and doesn't have a verification method? And where the voter has no way to confirm if he actually voted for that candidate.
So Petro, today he woke up, furious because they lost yesterday. It wasn't such a big difference. Yeah, it's been really close there according to the vote counts. But he accuses Israel. He woke up accusing Israel of interfering and violating the security of the magic boxes in the Colombian electoral process. Look at that paradigm, right? The Brazilian left insists and swears up and down that they are inviolable. The Peruvian left and the Colombian left say that they are flawed and demand a recount in the electoral process. So guys, how does all this turn out? Two left-wing countries questioning, two countries governed by the left, right, or in electoral processes, question the truthfulness of the result, question how it works. And even more serious, right? Colombia questions the inviolability of the so-called little device. Commander Batistella, now you're intelligence analyst side, right? The spy hunter accusing Israel of interference in the magic box. Is that a tactic or is it something tangible and real? Could that have happened?
It's tangible because anyone can say whatever they want. The problem is proving it afterwards and bringing facts that support the argument. What draws attention is why Israel? So why not the United States? Could it be because we know about the presence of Iranians in Venezuela? Why Israel? Why Israel, which is in conflict indirectly, actually in direct conflict with Iran through Hezbollah, through southern Lebanon, right? So why does the president of Colombia, whose candidate lost, mention Israel? If there were going to be claims of open interference, the political community knows about President Trump's support for the now elected Lula. It would be more reasonable then to direct this kind of accusation, let's call it that, toward the United States. As an intelligence analyst, I conclude it only confirmed Iran's presence in South America.
Wow, huh? Amazing.
That's the conclusion I come to.
Yeah, really amazing. And that's it, folks. Iran loses. Iran is defeated, right, Galante? Iran really regretted the defeat of the left in Colombia, and here we see the Iranian role, not only in Venezuela, where they had more than 6 military bases. Can you imagine Iran having military bases in Brazil with Iranian soldiers, with Iranian commanders walking around there? Oh.
Bubble, too.
And did that exist in Venezuela and Colombia, Galante?
That's what the commander is saying. Batistella being present in Bolivia a year before Paz won the elections in Bolivia, the previous government, which was left-wing, made a strategic agreement with Iran, a strategic agreement between Bolivia and Iran. And this coincides with the increase in the volume of cocaine seizures. Not only in the Caribbean, but also in Europe, in the Mediterranean Sea, and also in Middle Eastern countries. being transported by elements linked to Iranian proxies, which is Hezbollah. There is a strong presence of Hezbollah in the Brazil, Paraguay, Argentina tri-border area. And Brazil, there next to Paraguay and Argentina, is already entering into an agreement, with the American DEA. In other words, you have American agents on the other side of the border helping. And Brazil refuses to directly help by authorizing American forces on national territory to work together with the federal police. They only contribute intelligence, but not operationally side by side, like it's done in Paraguay and Argentina, and like it's being done in Bolivia. That's why the leftists, who are the ones controlling the states and the areas where cocaine is grown, the largest amount is still in Bolivia, but you also have it in Colombia and a little in Venezuela. Venezuela doesn't have large-scale plantations, but Colombia does, and so does Bolivia. And you have Evo Morales' people trying to forcibly take over the country. They've blocked 44 roads. They've been out on the streets causing disturbances for over 20 days now. For what? And just yesterday, everything happened in a week, everything, right? The country declared a state of emergency to be able to contain it in Peru. This uprising from the left. So when the left loses at the polls, what do? They start a revolution. It's the same playbook as Lenin and Stalin from the early 20th century.
Galante, they're setting Latin America on fire, right? They're going to react because they're really like a cornered beast. There's nowhere for them to go, right? Iran in the Middle East is succumbing to the United States and Israel, right? Hezbollah in Lebanon is also succumbing. So where will they go? Will they go to Russia, which is also losing a war, right? Where to? Will they go to China, right? Operate in China? No, because the Chinese don't accept that. They don't accept drug trafficking. Have you ever heard of drug trafficking in China? Of cocaine and fentanyl addicts in China, Galante? Have you ever heard of that, Commander? There isn't? There isn't.
It's common to see.
It's not common to see. Isn't it?
They don't have it, it's prohibited. They export it, they export fentanyl precursor chemicals and also export the material that's used to process cocaine in the laboratories of Latin America. They also fund the logistics and distribution not just to the United States but to Europe as well. This goes through Brazil, but they don't have it within their own country. Inside their country they don't have it. They want it to happen in other countries because it's about hybrid warfare, about weakening the social fabric of their adversaries. Galante.
Did we make a provocation?
Go ahead.
Isn't it an OPEC opium war in reverse? Less of an opium war, absolutely less.
They've already learned from the opium war.
Right, yeah, opium.
I'd like to highlight here, for the listeners, for the viewers here, the opium war was at the beginning of the 20th century when the United States, England, with the support of the United States, introduced opium into China so that it would weaken the population and they wouldn't have the strength to mobilize politically. And so it would open up like that. So
England would open up navigation in China. They forced open the Chinese market.
That's how England continued to own Hong Kong until 1997. Just a few years ago, China was still colonizing Hong Kong. And then there was the handover of Hong Kong. So China learned during the time of Mao Zedong. They concluded that they were really sabotaged by the global empires of the 20th century. And today they are getting back at them, returning the favor, doing the opposite. An opium war 2.0, I agree with you, Commander Battistella. Thank you.
Look at that. So we've mapped out here, folks, that Latin America really is at war. It's just that we're not seeing missiles flying back and forth. We don't have alarms going off like they do in the Middle East, but we are at war. Now, Galante, here's the thing. What is Trump going to do to stop this? Look at this. What is Trump going to do to prevent Brazil from becoming a stronghold of narco-terrorism, Islamic radicalism, and the São Paulo Forum? Or is he simply not going to do anything and let Brazil go up in flames? Galante, that's the million-dollar question that only you and Commander Battistella can answer here on the show. That's why it's hard work to do this, right, folks? Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Come on, Galante, what's going on? Because I heard from a little bird that you were in Brazil, but nobody saw you. But you were in Brazil taking care of important things. Now tell us here on the show.
I'm already doing it. The issue of the American Strategic Plan, the National Security Strategy, which was launched in December 25, it clearly outlines it's open to the public. It's about entering the White House and National Intelligence Directorate. The top American priority is to restabilize security in the Western Hemisphere, including the United States and all Latin and South American countries. In implementing this plan, hemispheric security is paramount. So the first step is to financially suffocate drug trafficking. You are already seeing this, the designation of the PCC and ICV and 26 other organizations from countries like Guatemala, Mexico, Honduras. They are all listed on the DOFAC list, harassing and financially suffocating, which is the one that buys the weapon and pays for the transport to resell it, not just the processing, but also the purchase of precursor materials from China. So what is the money needed for? First, to buy the precursors from China in order to process this drug. Second, after it's processed, to transport it by air, sea, and land routes to the United States, to Europe, and also to Brazil, which also suffers from the drug problem. And third, the money is needed to pay for security and to pay the operators of these operations, which today are more sophisticated, using fintechs to be able to spread this money in the market and acquire what? Acquire not only banks, but fintechs like gas stations, hotels, restaurants, real estate, buildings, and spread this economic empire that is created through drugs. The second is direct confrontation with military force to destroy and decapitate the leaders, as you can see there. Last week, the leader of Tren de Aragua was killed inside Venezuela in an operation by an American drone, a joint operation with the Venezuelan military. You have to ask yourself, 6 months ago, would you have imagined that the Venezuelan military would be conducting joint operations with American military inside Venezuela? And the detail that wasn't mentioned, 2 kilometers from the border with Brazil. Damn, over there in Roraima, 2 kilometers from the border. And 3 days later, the day before I arrived in Brasilia, where I was at the Foreign Relations and National Defense Committee, dealing with the issue of designating these 2 cartels as terrorists. On the same day, he was arrested at Galeão Airport trying to flee Brazil. The CFO, who was the person in charge of the money for Tren de Aragua, the largest transnational gang from Venezuela, operating on American territory, operating all over the world. And the money man was in Rio de Janeiro trying to escape through Galeão Airport. Wow, what a surprise, right? So yeah, and what is he doing, Trump? He's following this plan to the letter. The issue of Brazil's geopolitical encirclement that's happening. In other words, the governments of Argentina, Paraguay, Bolivia, now Colombia have changed, and with the collaboration of the Venezuelan government, only Uruguay, Brazil, and the governments of the 2 Guyanas are left. Since Suriname is already aligned with the United States, there are American forces inside Suriname, which were even used to try to capture Maduro. So, the geopolitical siege, economic strangulation, and direct confrontation with the leaders, decapitation, targeted attack operations by boats in the Caribbean, and also the decapitation or capture of the leaders, which is the case with Maduro. Yes, that's the American strategy. And of course, the Brazilian ballot boxes won't be left out because the United States doesn't look favorably on the fact that Brazilian elections are not audited, or rather, auditable.
What is Trump going to do about the magic boxes, Galante? Is he going to contest it? Is he going to call credibility into question? Is he going to demand paper printouts? Is he going to demand that someone from the United States oversee this process? What are they going to do, Galante? What do they intend to do?
Look, we're heading into an interesting situation where Lula himself, President Lula, has spoken out on this issue. There was a closed-door meeting. On the 7th, this issue was addressed, and the United States made it clear the concern they have about the matter. How is Europe moving toward the cessation of people's rights to freely express themselves without being persecuted? Trapped on social media, and that's one of the reasons that led to Starmer's resignation today, the English Prime Minister. You still have the issue in Romania where Georgescu remains imprisoned. There's the issue in France, where Le Pen is still banned from participating in the elections. So that group of seven that was there behind closed doors brought this concern to them. Look, we're the G7, we're NATO, but are you kidding? Are you playing with dictators in your country? Or are we here defending freedom and democracy? Or are we pretending that there is freedom and democracy just to wage war against dictatorial countries like China, Russia, Iran? But when it's time for the people to choose their leader, they are silenced, gagged, and the candidates, including President Bolsonaro, are prevented from running. So it's not me saying this. President Lula left that meeting very irritated. Yeah, he was there. He took it to the UN, right, and to the other members of the seventh, the idea of using the magic boxes so that the UN would suggest countries use the boxes, which are the most modern in the world. The results come out in 2 hours, and that he didn't win in 98, didn't win in 2002, didn't win in 94, and then after 94, 98, but he won in 2002 and never left power again. This was caught on a hot mic where he directly criticized President Trump, saying he shouldn't interfere as it's a Brazilian matter. But the calculation is that this shift in Colombia and the left's attitude in wanting to audit the process, which there I'm even seeing here on the internet, is done mostly just on paper. There are electronic magic boxes, but there aren't many. Less than 10 are used, but there it's all on paper. And it will end up encouraging the United States to take the same stance it took with Venezuela. On August 1st, 2024, my request to President Trump, my direct request to him, was that they use the same criteria of not accepting the election result in Venezuela. Maduro's, because they didn't present disaggregated data, which would be against the paper ballot evidence. So in reality, everything I've said here, President Lula is helping a lot in our effort to bring light and legality to the process that only Brazil uses nowadays.
So the Americans are going to scrutinize the elections in Brazil. Well, Lula wouldn't make a vague speech, right? Just as rhetoric. Lula's speeches within intelligence. I think Commander Batistella can talk to us about that. Lula's reactions at the G7 were legitimate reactions from someone who felt attacked, and not just from a lunatic making a speech out of turn, Batistella.
I understand that as well. I thought the speeches and statements did not contribute to the enhancement of Brazil's name or the Brazilian state. And obviously, all of this was captured, as Galante rightly pointed out, right? Nowadays, we need to be very careful with these open microphones. And what was captured on these open microphones is compromising, not because of the words themselves, but because of the context as a whole. It's common. It's not just today that Brazilian society has in some way been questioning this issue. I'm going to follow the advice here from the channel's representative, Shimon Oliveira, from the Magic Boxes. Yeah, especially because something like this is unacceptable in a country that calls itself democratic. Not being able to use the correct term because there might be some restriction. And I will also support what Galante said, because for the same reasons, I also believe that the British Prime Minister felt compelled to resign. It's the issue of imposing a rule, a norm, a law. Why should young people under 16 have to use some kind of biometric system to confirm their identity in order to use social media? That sounds very nice. That sounds very interesting from the perspective of a parent, of someone who wants to protect their children's use of social networks. I'm a father, so I worry about that. But was that really the true intention? Was it really to create a reliable entry system, or was it to create a pretext so that later other barriers to the use of social networks could be put in place, as they are more or less designed? And it's no coincidence that, in addition to what you're mentioning, the main leaders, CEOs of these big tech companies like Google, OpenAI, and even Anthropic were at the G7. Businessmen who went there to meet with political leaders, already to discuss issues like regulation, for example. That's where young people come in so that teenagers and children don't talk to a chatbot like this and end up being deceived. Yes, that was among the topics discussed at the G7 meeting. However, it's very interesting when we see that in Europe itself, the cradle of Western democracy as a whole, we now come across measures that are not coherent, that are not consistent. So I want to reinforce what you said. And Brazil, once again, right? I would bring this up to our Congress, right? What are our representatives and senators thinking, analyzing about this? First of all,
before we get into Cuba, which has also just radically changed its position, right? And that's very important for Brazil as well. The outcome at the G7, we could say it was a disaster for President Lula, who didn't get any support to keep himself afloat here in the upcoming elections. It was clear that he was seeking direct support for the elections, just as the right wing now definitely has the support of the United States. He tried to bring in European support, right? China usually doesn't get directly involved in electoral processes. Russia doesn't even have the energy to do that right now. So Lula ran to his European friends and got a solemn no from Macron, even a kind of political rejection. It was as if Lula was toxic. It's like that friend of yours at the party who smells bad and nobody has the courage to tell him to go home and take a shower because things are getting ugly for him. Galante, how do you assess that?
The effects of this G7 meeting made it clear that England's position has become unsustainable. For Starmer, it was the rejection of using Diego Garcia Island in the kinetic engagement with Iran. So they banned the use of the base by American bombers and also did everything to make it difficult to use the English military bases in Europe for the military effort in Ali in the engagement with Iran. This country has not cooperated with naval forces, with military forces. It has not cooperated with logistics, and Trump made it clear that this was unacceptable. So not only the censorship within England, but also the military relationship with the Americans made Starmer's position unsustainable. And the party itself must have asked him to leave and resign today. The result of the G7 shows the turnaround in Colombia, the solidification of the American position in controlling the Western Hemisphere. And also, once and for all, it forces the G7 countries to take a stand. Either they are on the Western side, on the American side, on the side of the market economy, freedom of speech, democracy, electoral transparency, or they are playing both sides to help China and Russia. And India has already taken a stand. Then last month, India just signed the rare earth contract with the United States. It took a military stance. Even Pakistan, which used to be an adversary in many areas, was an American adversary, also took a position to try to mediate from this possible peace agreement with Iran, knowing that Pakistan has a lot to lose with it. In the relationship there with China, in the relationship there with India, and that's it. The world was multipolar. It became bipolar between the United States and China. But the American stance in denying the use of the Middle East, as well as Europe and Latin America and the South, for Chinese interests will become so in a few years, right? I see this clearly. In 5 to 10 years, you see a unipolar world where the United States once again has total hegemony, like it was right after World War II.
Wow, that's an analysis that's going to make a lot of people pull their hair out, right? And Cuba? Now look, Commander Batistella is about 25 years old, right? Galante is also about 23 years old, and Shimon Oliveira here is 10 years old. Have you ever imagined in your life seeing Cuba turn capitalist? Tell the truth, confess, but confess.
I'm wondering if this news is true. I wouldn't like to believe that from the counterintelligence perspective, this is a deception when we make the target believe in something. And the basis of a deception operation, whose term comes from English deception, but translated into Portuguese is not disappointment, it's deceit or trickery, right? Every deception has phases, but the first phase is the truth. If you start to deceive someone, you first proclaim something that is true. And this truth, over time, will be manipulated. Look, I'm still like this, trying to analyze this from the counterintelligence perspective. To what extent this Cuban demonstration is genuine? I believe it is the result of great American pressure to force a realignment, more or less like what happened in Venezuela, more or less. In other words, to accommodate the internal forces, the tectonic plates, the political forces of the country, and to make changes in a way that isn't too abrupt in order to avoid what? Clashes in the streets. In Venezuela, for a certain period at the beginning, right after Maduro was captured, there was a lot of talk that there would be bloodshed in Venezuela. And thank God we didn't see that happen. There is still much to reflect on regarding the effectiveness, efficiency, and efficacy of the American operation that captured Maduro, and to what extent Venezuela will once again become a great country. We know that Venezuela in the 70s and 80s was considered a jewel in South America, right? It was Argentina here with Paris in Buenos Aires, and Venezuela with that Caribbean wonder. And then we saw the deplorable economic situation that our Venezuelan neighbors ended up in. I am analyzing the issue of Cuba as a strong pressure, and very likely this was triggered by Marco Rubio, which resulted in such a level of pressure that it gave the regime a chance to readjust. That's how I'm interpreting it. It gave the regime a chance to readjust because otherwise, very likely, someone there would end up going to a federal prison in the United States.
Galante Raul Castro, who was indicted. Look how things are, right? Come on. An aircraft carrier leaves the east coast of the United States, circles all of the Americas, even passes through Rio de Janeiro, coincidentally when Lula was at the White House. This aircraft carrier goes up the Brazilian coast. This aircraft carrier reaches the Caribbean. The United States, well, on the day it arrived, the United States indicted Raul Castro. In other words, the American justice system has every right to go after him. And it gives the United States Armed Forces a door, a window for an operation to capture the criminal who is being hunted by the justice system. Right after that, Galante, you tell me if it's a coincidence. Raul Castro signs more than 100 laws opening the Cuban market to capitalism. That is, Cuba becomes capitalist. Right after the passage of this aircraft carrier, and look, the Nimitz aircraft carrier, which is retiring, is going to retire the regime or has already retired the regime. Communist regime that is also about the same age as the ship. Hey, Galante, is it just a coincidence or is it a plan being carried out right in front of our eyes?
This government, this Trump 2.0 administration will go down in history as the government that caused the biggest and deepest geopolitical changes since the Reagan administration and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Well said. Battistella spoke very well about the adjustment, and I would say that beyond the adjustment, it's a reinvention. We talked about it here on the show, and I had pointed out that the step-by-step process was that first you indict. For you to have a search warrant, so you don't have to carry out a military intervention, you have the search warrant, the execution of the search warrant by the American military, because the American Congress requires authorization to carry out an intervention within the country. So that was done. And then everything you described happened. The aircraft carrier was in Brazil. It went there. Lula was at the White House. Marco Rubio Rubén Sena came in. He spent 2 days on the island. This has already been documented by our intelligence sources. Marco Rubens himself spent 2 days on the island, making this agreement with Diaz-Canel, who actually, Castro's brother, is already 94 years old. Raul Castro's son, is Fidel Castro's grandson. He is very much aligned with Rubens. He wants economic openness. But Diaz-Canel needed to be convinced that he is, in fact, the commander of the Cuban military forces. This agreement was made. And today we see, just yesterday, the launch of 176 new laws and legislation to reopen the economy, to authorize. If you want, Brother Shimon and Battistella, today you can buy shares in a Cuban company. Did you know that? A Cuban state company. Go to the website and become an investor in the island of Cuba. I'm going to invest in Cuba. C'est bon.
It's going to blow up, right? How to protect your money and multiply your money in 2026, 2027, Cuba.
Vai pra Cuba.
Cuba. Jokes aside, the fact is that by decree, the end of the 1959 communist revolution in Cuba has been declared. Fidel Castro is turning over in his grave without a shot fired, which Batistella said was most important. This issue, the playbook here is Venezuela 2.0. You go there, take out the ones in charge, and force everyone else to make a smooth government transition, especially because Cuba is different from Venezuela. In Venezuela, you had an established opposition, an established political party. There's the excuse, the former senator who's there, Corina. You also have the president there, the former president of Congress, who was removed from her position. You have an established opposition. In Cuba, you don't have another political party. There's no established opposition. So I see Cuba as a Venezuela 2.0 with an addition. You'll have to create an engaged civil society. You'll have to recreate the democratic regime. But the United States already has that in their playbook. Do you know from where? From the failed attempt to create a democracy in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Iraq. Because it didn't work there, because the ancient culture, the Islamic religion, doesn't allow that to happen even today, and they gave up on it. It went back to being a semi-caliphate there in Iraq, but as long as they're aligned with the United States, that's what matters. But this playbook that didn't work in Iraq is supposed to work in Cuba, which is just 90 miles, 150 kilometers from Miami. So I see it very positively for Cuba to become a tourist destination again, one of the best in the world, to become a real estate market again, to start growing rapidly again. Service sectors, also agriculture, they have very strong agriculture, especially in ethanol, sugarcane production, vegetable production, and fruit production. Yeah, just there you have a country where today the culture of sugarcane in the 1960s wasn't as important as it is now. Today, it's directly part of the energy market. In the past, it was only part of the agricultural market, in the sugar production market. Today, it's not just about sugar production, but also about other carbohydrates, and mainly it's about energy. So Cuba has everything it needs to be a self-sufficient island, aligned with the United States and its people. Finally, after 60 years of darkness, to celebrate again and express their will. Not only at the polls, but also in the streets.
And many Brazilians asked the question. I was at the cafe on the corner near my studio, and Mr. João came in and asked me, Shimon, I watch you, I watch Galante, I see the commander speaking, but I have a hard time believing that Trump will have the power to change Brazil. And then I said, Mr. João, start reading the map of what is already happening, not what will happen, but what has already happened here in Latin America. And then I said to him, are you looking at Cuba? Look at Cuba. When did you ever imagine that Cuba would stop being a dictatorship and become capitalist? That's what's happening now at this very moment. And then he said, look, it's true. I believe we may see a change in Brazil. And it doesn't happen, right, with aircraft carriers firing missiles at Brasilia. No, it's enough for it to just pass by. It's enough for it, to circle around here in the area and the changes start to happen. Oh,
Batistella, can I make a contribution? You gave me the opening I wanted. I'm going to comment on a fact that, in my opinion, contributed a lot. Once again, mentioning the resignation of the British Prime Minister. And then we go straight to the importance of the sea. The sea, not just as a trade route, right? 95% of the world's commercial traffic moves through maritime lanes, through navigation routes, but the sea or the navy as a projection of power. Notice that days before the resignation of the Prime Minister, who had resigned in England, none other than the Minister of Defense, that's right, and he spoke his mind. He was very critical when talking about the declining situation of the British Armed Forces, especially which branch? The British Navy, which used to be, so to speak, one of the largest in the world. Nelson's Navy. I'm going to refer to a recent event which was barely mentioned here in Brazil, but was talked about in the international media. The fact that a Russian warship opened fire, called a warning shot, against a British sailboat that was sailing in international waters, so to speak, right off England's own coast. This shows Russia's increasingly prominent presence, despite all its war efforts being concentrated obviously in Ukraine. But how Putin is used and how the English Channel, all of this Baltic region that gets close to England, is being navigated by Russian ships and submarines that are there. And then for us, those who are more connected to the sea, it's just absurd to imagine a British warship firing a warning shot at a sailboat. That's almost unacceptable. That's unthinkable. That's unthinkable. I said unthinkable because it's something you can't even imagine, right? You just can't imagine. It's unthinkable for something like that to happen. And then you mentioned, Shimon, the issue, let's say, of American pressure, which obviously has the largest navy today. So I'm just bringing this up here to summarize its importance. Again, for us to reflect on this in Brazil, the importance of a navy that projects power, that provides reliability, that preserves our wealth in the Blue Amazon, right? Brazil has a huge coastline. There's a very important issue that's rarely discussed in Brazil, which is illegal fishing, and China is dominating it. The entire Pacific coast, along the coast of Chile, along the coast of Peru, with a real swarm of fishing vessels, illegal fishing boats. So we have, you talk about aircraft carriers, right, from a generation like the Nimitz, but I just want to reinforce the importance of these kinds of ships that project power. And most likely, the projection of this military power over Cuba led to the change of regime, while in England, the decline led to the fall of the prime minister.
In this accusation from the Navy commander, the general who resigned in the United Kingdom, he brought another attached accusation, which is he was it's the left-right from Starmer, taking money from defense and putting it into social programs for Islamic radicals to support Islamic radicalism as political pawns. So I take it out. There are 5 submarines sitting idle in a dock there in the United Kingdom, 5 submarines that were precisely meant to prevent Russia from interfering there, on the coast of the United Kingdom and in other parts of the world. 5 submarines idle at the same time for those who have almost nothing at all, money taken from defense. And that's what happened in Brazil now, Galante. Lula froze defense funds in order to comply with the fiscal framework to meet the quotas. And to reinforce the funds, look at that, advertising funds, because Lula's government hasn't stopped doing advertising. They are advertising 24 hours a day, even on YouTube channels, even on streaming channels. It's not just broadcast TV. They're in every corner you can imagine with PT propaganda and social programs. They haven't cut any social programs. But when it comes to defense, to Brazil's power projection with the Navy, Air Force, and everything else, that was cut, Galante.
Yes, and I would like to expand on what Batistella just said. Yeah, today, if the Falklands conflict happened now, if Argentina wanted to annex the Falklands, they would do it today with almost no reaction from the British. The British Navy today, which actually, along with the American Navy, are the only 2 navies in the world we call blue water navies, have this tradition of sailing all over the world. China doesn't have a blue water navy. Brazil has been a coastal navy for a long time, and Russia doesn't have one either. It's a coastal navy. You have the only blue water navies, and one of them is inactive, has no money, no resources, and no longer has the importance it used to have. Today, if Argentina wants to annex the Malvinas, it will annex them. And this topic has already been brought up by Milei himself, Milei. It has already been brought up. It caused a diplomatic stir, and Trump took a neutral stance in this situation. Because back when Margaret Thatcher sent the British fleet to recover the Malvinas Islands in '82 from the Argentine military government at the time, Reagan provided fuel. The supply ships were American ships that refueled the British fleet as it went down the South Atlantic to carry out the mission. Nowadays, I ask the audience, and the answer is easy. Would the United States today refuel the British fleet to retake the Malvinas? Considering that they denied the use of British bases in Malta and denied the use of British bases in Diego Garcia for the United States to do what it did in Iran? So that issue still hasn't been settled. I don't rule out the possibility of the Malvinas being brought into the geopolitical negotiations at the UN Security Council in the very near future. This would benefit the United States more, because the air bases in the Malvinas are not being used. The Falklands, as the English call them, though Argentina calls them the Malvinas, they are not being used for the projection of American power in the Southern Cone to stop those fishing fleets, not only on the Argentine coast, but also on the Brazilian coast. Brazil doesn't have money, but if it had a base, if Brazil could use a base there in front of Argentina, in collaboration with Argentina, I'm sure that Brazilian and Argentine patrol ships could do the job much better than it's being done today. Because the coast is 200 miles from Argentina and Brazil, where the fishing boats, do illegal fishing, predatory fishing without any limits. The planes barely have enough fuel to reach the area, patrol for an hour or two, and return since there's nowhere to land and refuel. Now, if the base were in the Malvinas and if it had access for Americans, Brazilians, and Argentinians there, the story would be different. And it's not just about this Malvinas connection, like when Brazil recently the Lula government cut the budget by almost 50, then the operational budget of the armed forces, the army, of course, which is to collaborate even more with the Lula government, or to cause trouble, other internal factions. So I have internal data that it would be an act of defiance by the army to go there, cancel all border operations in the Amazon, not just in the Amazon, but also in the Pantanal, in the Western Command area of Brazil. They acted out against the Lula government and canceled the border surveillance operations against narco-terrorism. Right after the United States designated the PCC and CV as terrorist organizations, it makes no sense at all. If it was an act of defiance from the Army High Command, it's a very, very stupid act of defiance, isn't it? Because they could cut the general's lobster in Brasilia, cut their half-day shifts, or suspend regular duty at the Brazilian bases in the Southeast and Midwest, but they should never leave the borders unguarded. So today, Brazil is unguarded, either because of defiance or incompetence of the army, which decided not to carry out border operations anymore, while the contingency regime is in effect in Brazil. I never thought that in my life I would be here, Shimon, in front of you, feeling this embarrassment of saying that the Brazilian armed forces are either incompetent or complicit with the leftist government when it comes to defending the borders. Yes.
And it seems like complicity makes sense, doesn't it? Complicity makes sense because everything is very synchronized. You have the United States putting pressure from one side and the other. Where are they going to run? Where are they going to escape to? They need refuge, or at least a last refuge, and Brazil today is that perfect paradise. At least there are still a few more months until October, right? Yeah, to gather here, and on the other side we have a party that's cornered and also needs reinforcements from all sides. It's the last attempt, it's the last bastion of the Latin American left to win the elections in Brazil, right? It's about maintaining this refuge of the São Paulo Forum of narco-terrorism in one of the most important countries, even logistically, for the narco-terrorists and for the São Paulo Forum. Where will they go? Where will the left go if Lula falls? Because Cuba has already shown what it's doing and nobody wants to go to Cuba for now. Venezuela is also in the hands of the United States. Colombia has just handed everything over to the United States, and so has Peru. Where will they go? Brazil is the last resort for all of these, for all these organizations, whether it's the São Paulo Forum. They will do
what they're doing in Bolivia. They will create an internal uprising. They will create an internal revolt. And in the context of these operational budget restrictions of the Brazilian armed forces, it's a very serious thing because Commander Bastella knows, and I know very well, we also serve together. When you cut operational resources for a year or two, you create a gap of 5 to 10 years, an operational gap, a gap in operational capability. It's not just about buying the equipment, it's about knowing how to operate the equipment. It's about training the new soldiers and also maintaining the assets. If they go without maintenance for a year or two, they end up being thrown away. You have to buy new ones. So imagine next year, for example, if the left loses the election in Brazil, you have popular uprisings in the streets. And suppose you need to activate the armed forces to contain the situation, like what's happening now in Bolivia, and then you have an outdated armed force. because the fighter pilots of the Air Force are leaving by the dozens every year to go fly for Azul, to fly for TAM. So how long does it take to train a fighter pilot? He's qualified to fly a plane like that, which costs about $20 to $30 million each. It takes 10 years. So the lack of salary, the lack of funding in the armed forces, it's going to create gaps that can only be filled 5 or 10 years from now, depending on whether it's the Navy, the Air Force, or the Army itself. And you could have a scenario in 2 or 3 years where the armed forces won't be able to fight drug trafficking, which could trigger a strong reaction against any supposed new government that wants to confront things at Bukele's level within Brazil to retake the 25% of the territory that is now lost to drug trafficking. They simply won't have the operational capacity, the technical capacity, the capability, the material capacity to face this and guarantee the safety of Brazilians. So the left thinks 10 years ahead. Yeah. Are those who have responsibility, the institutions, thinking 10 years ahead? That's the big question.
It's a huge trap they're digging for the next president. But there's a difference, right? As I usually say, if you stay, you're in trouble. If you run, you're in trouble too. Why? You have 2 years of Trump, you have 2 years of American money available, and that's the difference. The United States is willing to pour money to change the entire continent, Galante. So, the left is going to leave this gap, they're going to leave this trap. But on the other hand, this moment, which is also unprecedented, of a foreign willingness to even help Brazil close its borders, to help reinforce Brazil, and to make the money circulate in all of this with training, with operations, with intelligence, with satellites, whatever it is they make available. And then I think the left doesn't foresee this either because they're forcing the next government to run even more into the arms of the United States to face this whole system they've built over the last few years.
I agree. Batistella must have the same view, right? Yes, I believe that the issue in Brazil is actually a bit more delicate because here at this moment we're dealing with an issue very focused on the precarious situation, which is well known, right? Because the military commanders have already said this, even in hearings at Credem, where you were present, Galante, but also in Congress. The minister of defense said that the armed forces don't exist. So we are in a very degrading situation regarding our military capability. And here, I think I've already said this, I don't see this happening in the very near future. No, I see this in a much more distant future. If you ask me, I don't see any possibility of a confrontation between Brazil and the United States. Brazil may have political differences. We know that there will also be possible political changes. Trump won't be around forever, and Trumpism, the Trump doctrine, could also change in the next administration and so on. Changes are welcome, as we hope, changes that are also positive for Brazil. But honestly, these are countries that are on the same side here in the Americas, and Brazil has ties with the United States. Anyway, so we have to see. No one here is supposed to be submissive to the United States. We have our own ideals, but you can't say we're not friendly countries, right? We overcame rivalries with Argentina in the 1970s, right? There used to be mutual distrust, and today when you look at Brazil and Argentina, it's about competing in soccer, that's all. From now on, who knows, right? We face Argentina and win, we have to win. Now then, setting aside this military aspect, I'm going to make a point here on a sensitive topic, because it's not just about the military aspect, no. We have to look a little inside Brazil. And look at our academia, look at our universities, yes, look at our education systems, then high school, higher education, because there is a lot of indoctrination in Brazilian educational institutions nowadays in general. And they preach anti-Americanism. I think that criticizing the United States can be valid. No, nobody is here to flatter Americans. No, that's not it. But there are situations where we need to look and say, hey, this path might be better for Brazil. But it seems to me that our educational system has adopted in the last, let's say, 20 or 30 years, a radical stance. Especially because nowadays, if you say you're North American or from the United States, it means this or that. It's my God, right? The Portuguese language is bigger than that. Where am I going with this? Yeah, Brazil needs to rethink certain concepts about our own society, about our stance. And here's the thing: beat our chest and say, this South America is ours and let's go. Let's exercise our leadership here with respect for neighboring countries, but we have to exercise it. Geography imposes this on us. This is geopolitics. I'll repeat, this is geopolitics. The geography of South America imposes on Brazil the need to exercise leadership. The South Atlantic imposes it on Brazil. We have to stand tall and say, I am going to take care of this South Atlantic here for the good, for social prosperity. We're talking about something important, which is the issue of food security that comes from the sea. For that, you need a navy, but you also need an air force, you need borders, an army, and so on. So Brazil needs to wake up, right? I think Brazil needs to rethink itself a bit, and let's believe in a better future for the country.
All right, Galante, do you have any other item you want to talk about?
It's the question of what to expect from this mess and this deadlock regarding the Strait of Hormuz. As for Hormuz, I see that the negotiations have deteriorated. There was an attempt at a round of negotiations. But Iran, today I see Iran as very weak militarily. They can carry out a targeted attack there on a ship, launch a missile here. In fact, the last missile barrages launched even against Israel were all repelled. It shows that the missile arsenal that was more operational or more modern has already been completely used up. You are left only with guerrilla tactics and techniques where the damage that can be caused is very small, but it can still cause some harm. There, in the Strait of Hormuz, I see that today they are in a weak position, and this weak position leaves them with no other option but to be a puppet of China. And I think the public will start to see China's interests will become much clearer. There, the moment will come when 60% of the oil China imports passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Not only from countries like Oman and Iran, they also import from Iran, but also from Saudi Arabia, Oman, and other countries. On the other side of that strait, yes, it will eventually come to an end because the need to maintain the energy flow to China is imperative. Not to mention that the United States has control over the Strait of Malacca, there near the Philippines, where they made a strategic agreement. If this continues in the Strait of Hormuz, the United States has every right. That's what the commander says. This is geopolitics, and also about strangling the flow of oil through the Strait of Malacca. So, a little patience. There will be a lot of verbiage, attacks on Twitter, people raising flags saying they won the war, that the other side won the war, that one side imposed itself. But I see the clearing of the Strait of Hormuz as a geopolitical imposition. Not for the United States, not for Iran, but for China and Russia. For what? For what, right? Otherwise, they also won't be able to continue with the war effort they're making there in Ukraine. And we're seeing Ukrainian attacks getting farther and farther inside Russia itself. The war has arrived, it has reached Moscow, it's at people's doorstep. This is very serious. Moscow has only been attacked twice in history, during Napoleon's time and during Hitler's time. Still, Hitler didn't cause as much damage as the Ukrainians are now. So the second half of the year looks promising, and there are elections in Brazil, which, as he said, makes up 50% of South America's territory. The entire South Atlantic is like Brazil's Strait of Hormuz, and that's a reality. We have to positively maintain control of the South Atlantic axis, and we have to assert ourselves economically. Because 50% of the economy, 50% of the population, and 50% of South America's territory is Brazilian, and it can't be otherwise. The Brazilian population, Brazilian entrepreneurs, the Brazilian political class can no longer accept the country being without a strategic plan, a strategic security plan, a long-term plan of what is Brazil's role in this new world, which is multipolar for now, but I foresee a unipolar world in the next 15 or 20 years, and which could certainly in 30 years go back to being a multipolar or bipolar world. But Brazil needs to have this geographic and strategic dominance, a geopolitical strategy in the South Atlantic and in South America. And why not in the food security of the entire world?
Very well. And all this to contain the Chinese advance, right? Look how things are, right? We end up having positive results here in Brazil because American interests are broader than just Latin America. But it's about containing an advance that challenges its own hegemony, its own history. All right, folks, let's go. Galante's social media, 10,000 new subscribers on Galante's channel. Look, this chat deserves it, huh? It's hard work to bring Galante here, to bring Commander Battistella to talk to us, so I want you to subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, like the video, and head over to Galante's channel now, okay? Galante, what's the address of your YouTube channel? Well,
On YouTube, M. Galante Magalante Us. And on Instagram, Mauricio Galante, mauriciogalante.us. Yes, we keep doing this work here together with you, shoulder to shoulder, Shimon and Commander Battistella, to inform you about what's relevant in geopolitics and international diplomacy.
guys, here's the collab, okay? Go there, follow Galante, say, I came from Shimon Oliveira. Let's help Galante's network grow so we can amplify these voices. There aren't enough voices in Brazil that reflect reality, that bring a different perspective from what we see on Globo, on television. They don't want change, they don't want to see a different country because for them, money keeps coming into their pockets. It doesn't go into the military forces, it doesn't go into our borders, it doesn't go into our universities, but it does go into Globo's coffers. Ask any Globo executive what do they have to complain about the Lula government. Absolutely nothing, because it was one of the private Brazilian organizations that received the most public money. So they have nothing to complain about. And also follow Commander Battistella on the intelligence and counterintelligence list there on Instagram, and now I even forgot the name of the other network, LinkedIn, right? LinkedIn. What's the address there, Battistella?
Yeah, my name on Instagram is Luis with an S, Fernando Baptistella. There's a silent P and two L's, that's my name. And on LinkedIn too, Luis with an S, Luis Fernando Baptistella. Very well. I'm present there, I make some posts.
It's easy. Battistella's book is here about intelligence and counterintelligence, which we always talk about. I'll leave it in the card for you to get this book so you can understand how to analyze the world from this perspective. Based on intelligence operations. Okay, guys, look at that. And there's the bedside book over there. Look, Galante has the bedside book. All right, then.
One of the phrases in the book, Shimon, is, if you're not concerned about geopolitics, the geopolitics of some actor is concerned about your company. Yeah, and that's not a cliche. That phrase really exists. It originated from British intelligence in the early 20th century. We don't, Galante, you yourself, we don't use this word geopolitics as a cliche, no. Yeah, that deserves study, analysis, and deeper understanding. It has a connection with history, right? Yeah, I think the intention is exactly to help people reflect on what's happening. After all, I think we all want a better world and a better Brazil.
Now, do you understand why we need to have people like Galante here, people like Commander Battistella, who are qualified and present, all of us with a real reading of the map as it is? Take a look. Every single day you ask me how I manage to master communication, face the system, and speak to millions of people here on YouTube, on Instagram, on social media. How do you break the barrier of 1 million views without relying on paid traffic or the goodwill of the algorithm? That's why I decided to make a lethal decision. I'm going to open the black box of my method. I'm going to open the doors of my own studio in Curitiba for an exclusive in-person immersion. Pay attention. It's not a recorded course, it's not a crowd lecture. There will be only 10 people at most. 10 spots for those who will sit at this same table with me to learn hands-on about scripting, retention, recording, and how to position yourself with unshakable authority. If you want to stop being invisible online and turn your voice into a weapon of influence, just like we did right now, the QR code for this immersion is pulsing on the screen right now, and the link is pinned in the comments and in the video description. This could be your big turning point. It's time to dive headfirst into the digital world and even gain influence and money. And if you're tired of wasting time looking for a good movie or a good series to watch on Netflix or Amazon, we've created a channel with tips on series and movies. No woke culture, no whining. You check out the recommendation and enjoy it with your family on the weekend. Okay then? Link in the description, in the pinned comment, and in the card that's showing up on your screen. Now subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and like the video because it takes work to make. Shield your mind. I'm Shimon Oliveira and I'll see you in the next video. See you then.